Nestled on the winding, sun-dappled hills of Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles, Marlon Brando's former home has always carried an air of mystique. Once a retreat for the legendary actor, the property, though now owned by someone else, is still whispered about among locals and Hollywood enthusiasts. Some claim Brando never truly left. On a quiet evening, just as the golden California sun dipped below the horizon, a man and his partner, recent buyers of the property, were relaxing on the backyard terrace. The house, though meticulously renovated, retained its mid-century charm, wood-paneled walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that opened onto an expansive backyard. That evening, a faint sound began to rise over the chirping crickets. It was a low, murmuring voice, barely audible at first. The words were unclear, but the cadence was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and almost rhythmic. The couple froze, listening intently. It sounded like someone was reciting a monologue, the man later recounted to friends. It wasn't coming from inside the house, but it felt close, like it was carried on the breeze. Determined to find the source, they stepped cautiously into the backyard. The air was cool, the faint scent of jasmine drifting on the wind. As they scanned the property, the woman gasped softly and gripped her partner's arm. There, near the edge of the yard where the garden met a cluster of trees, stood a figure. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what appeared to be a white t-shirt and slacks. For a moment they thought it was an intruder, but as they watched, the figure moved with an almost ethereal quality, shifting in and out of focus. It wasn't just a man, the woman whispered. It was him. Indeed, the figure bore a striking resemblance to Marlon Brando in his younger years, the unmistakable face of a man who had captured the world's imagination in A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. He stood silently, gazing out into the night as though lost in thought. As the couple stepped closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the trees. The backyard fell silent, save for the rustling leaves. They waited, calling out, but no response came. When they returned to the house, the faint murmur of a voice resumed. It seemed to emanate from the living room, where Brando was known to have spent hours rehearsing lines or reflecting on life. The voice faded as they approached, leaving behind only an inexplicable chill in the air. Neighbors, when told of the encounter, were not surprised. "You're not the first," one said with a knowing smile. "People say they hear him sometimes muttering, rehearsing, like he's still preparing for his next big role." The story spread quickly, adding another layer to the myth of Brando's enigmatic life. Some speculate that the actor, a man of immense talent and solitude, left behind an imprint of himself in the home where he once found solace. Whether it's a trick of the mind or something more, those who visit the house often find themselves listening closely, as if expecting to hear the quiet echo of his unforgettable voice. The couple's nights in the house grew increasingly peculiar. The whispers, always faint and low, like a distant rehearsal, seemed to come and go unpredictably. Some nights they would hear nothing at all. On others, the murmurs felt almost conversational, as though the unseen presence was exchanging lines with a partner only it could perceive. Driven by curiosity, the man decided to investigate. He scoured the property's history and unearthed records of Brando's eccentric habits during his time there. The actor, it was said, would often pace the backyard late into the night, reciting lines to the stars, as if rehearsing for a role only he could understand. Locals spoke of spotting him at odd hours, his iconic white t-shirt glowing faintly under the moonlight as he wandered the grounds in quiet solitude. One evening, the couple invited a few friends over, sharing their story over wine and laughter. A skeptic among them, a filmmaker and ardent debunker of the supernatural, brushed it off as imagination fueled by Hollywood myth. But as the group settled into the living room, the air seemed to shift. The skeptic stopped mid-sentence, his expression faltering. "Did you hear that?" he asked. The group fell silent. From the corner of the room, faint but distinct, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. They watched, breathless, as one of the antique lamps on the far table flickered briefly before casting the room back into shadow. A chill crept through the air, though all the windows were closed. And then, without warning, a low voice emerged. It was unmistakably male, rich and gravelly, though the words were indiscernible. The sound seemed to envelop the room, as though emanating from every wall. The skeptic, pale and visibly shaken, suggested they leave the house immediately. But the woman, her curiosity now outweighing her fear, decided to follow the sound. The others reluctantly trailed behind as she moved toward the source of the voice, which seemed to pull them toward the hallway leading to Brando's old study. The door, though long disused, stood slightly ajar. Inside, the room appeared untouched, as if preserved in time. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the faint light of a distant street lamp filtering through the window. On the desk lay a faded script, the pages yellowed with age. The man reached for it, but the moment his fingers brushed the paper, the room was plunged into darkness. A rush of cold air swept through, and the voice, now clear and resonant, spoke a single word. Why? It was not a question, but a demand, heavy with emotion. The room fell silent once more, leaving them to wonder who or what had asked, and what answer was expected. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The group stood frozen in the study, the oppressive silence wrapping around them like a shroud. The single word, why, echoed in their minds, each of them grappling with its meaning. The script on the desk seemed heavier now, as though it had absorbed the weight of the question itself. The woman, her heart pounding, reached out hesitantly to lift the script. She turned the first page, revealing faded annotations scrawled in the margins, words underlined, phrases circled. It was a draft of a streetcar named Desire, but the notes were unlike anything they had seen before. Lines of dialogue had been crossed out and rewritten in a trembling hand, as if the writer had been searching desperately for the right words. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The skeptic, regaining a fraction of his bravado, leaned closer. "It looks personal," he muttered. "Not just a script. More like thoughts he didn't want anyone to see." Before anyone could respond, the air in the room grew colder still. The lamp on the desk flickered to life, casting a pale, unsteady glow. On the wall opposite the desk, the faint outline of a shadow appeared. It was unmistakably a man, shoulders hunched, pacing back and forth as if deep in thought. The figure stopped, turned toward the desk, and raised a hand as though reaching for the script. The woman stepped back instinctively, clutching the document to her chest. The shadow froze, and for a brief moment, the room filled with a presence so powerful, so overwhelming, that the group felt rooted to the floor. The voice returned, louder this time, layered with anguish and frustration. "Why didn't I?" The question hung in the air, incomplete, as if it had been snatched away before it could fully form. The shadow dissipated, and the room fell still. But the script in the woman's hands began to change. Ink bled onto the page, as though someone were writing in real time. The new words were disjointed, almost frantic. "I could have done more. The lines were wrong. They never understood." The group stared in disbelief. The skeptic muttered something under his breath, but his words were drowned out by a sudden sound. A sharp, deliberate knock from the hallway outside. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. The kind of knock you'd expect at a door, though no one had come to the house. "I think we should leave," the man whispered, his voice trembling. But the woman wasn't ready. She flipped through the script, her fingers shaking, searching for answers. At the very back, tucked between 2 pages, she found a photograph yellowed, its edges worn. It was of Brando, seated at the same desk they now stood beside, his head bowed as though burdened by a secret. In the corner of the photo, faintly scribbled in pencil, were the words, "Still unfinished." The knock came again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. The light in the study flickered and dimmed, and the door to the hallway began to creak open on its own. Beyond it lay not the familiar hallway, but something else entirely, a vast, dimly lit space that none of them recognized. And from within that space came a sound that would haunt them forever. The low, unmistakable murmur of Marlon Brando, reciting lines from a play that had never been written. The group stared in disbelief at the open door, their eyes adjusting to the strange, dimly lit expanse beyond it. The hallway of the house was gone, replaced by what appeared to be a vast, theatrical stage. Shadows danced across a floor that seemed to stretch endlessly, shrouded in a hazy, dreamlike glow. Rows of empty seats faded into the gloom, as though the audience had long since departed or perhaps had never arrived. The murmuring voice grew louder, clearer now, resonating from the center of the stage. It wasn't just Brando's voice, it was layered, as if he were rehearsing with others, their words overlapping like a fragmented script. The words came in bursts, unfinished lines punctuated by sighs and whispers of frustration. Drawn forward, the woman clutched the script tightly, feeling the inexplicable pull of the stage. Her partner grabbed her arm. "Don't," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. But she shook her head, her curiosity overpowering her fear. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the air changed. The warmth of the California evening disappeared entirely, replaced by a sharp, almost electric chill. She stepped cautiously onto the stage, the floor beneath her shoes feeling unnervingly alive, as if it pulsed faintly with energy. The others hesitated before following, their movements slow and hesitant. As they approached the center of the stage, the shadows coalesced into a figure seated in a simple wooden chair. The figure's face was obscured, but the posture, the broad shoulders, the slight slump of weariness was unmistakable. It was Brando, or at least an echo of him. His hands rested on his knees, his head tilted down as if lost in thought. The murmurs continued, but his lips didn't move. "Mr. Brando?" the woman ventured, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the murmuring ceased abruptly, plunging the space into a silence so deep it felt oppressive. Then, slowly, the figure raised its head. Though its face remained indistinct, two piercing eyes seemed to lock onto hers, filled with a mixture of sadness and intensity. "You've brought it," the figure said, its voice layered with an otherworldly resonance. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. The woman looked down at the script in her hands. "This?" she asked, holding it out. Brando's shadow rose from the chair, its movements fluid yet heavy, as though burdened by an unseen weight. "The ending," it said softly. "They wouldn't let me finish it. They wouldn't understand." The woman glanced at her partner, who was now gripping her arm tightly. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "The words, the ones I never said. They're here." It gestured to the script, though the movement was more like a ripple in the air than a physical motion. "But they're not complete." Before she could respond, the stage around them began to shift. The shadows deepened, twisting into scenes. A living room with peeling wallpaper, a dimly lit street corner, a courtroom buzzing with inaudible arguments. Each scene flickered and changed, like fragments of a story struggling to assemble themselves. "Finish it," the figure said, its voice echoing as the scenes around them blurred into chaos. "Find the ending, or it will never stop." The lights on the stage dimmed further, and the sound of distant applause, soft and eerie, filled the air. The figure began to fade, but its eyes remained, locked on the woman as it whispered one last, chilling phrase. "Don't make my mistake." The shadows collapsed inward, and the group found themselves back in the study. The door to the hallway closed tightly behind them. The script in the woman's hands now bore new, incomplete lines scrawled in the margins. But as she turned the pages, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The final page was blank, and at the very bottom, in the same trembling handwriting, was a single sentence. "You must write the rest." The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, humming with tension. The group huddled together, staring at the blank page and the cryptic words. "You must write the rest." The air in the study felt heavier, as if the house itself was waiting, watching for their next move. "I'm not touching that thing," the skeptic muttered, backing away toward the door. His voice betrayed a thin veneer of bravado, but his hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe. "This is some elaborate trick. It has to be." The woman, however, couldn't take her eyes off the script. The words etched into its yellowed pages seemed to pulse faintly under the dim light, as though alive. "What if it's not a trick?" she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Her voice carried an odd mixture of fear and curiosity. "What if he's waiting for something?" "For what?" her partner snapped, his nerves fraying. "For us to write some ending? That's insane. He's gone. This isn't real." But even as he spoke, the faintest murmur rose again, curling through the air like smoke. It was indistinct, fragmented, yet insistent, like a forgotten thought clawing its way back to consciousness. The woman turned toward the desk, her fingers brushing against the aged surface. The photograph of Brando sat there, his bowed head and haunted expression now feeling like an accusation. "What if this is why we're here?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "What if he's trying to fix something? Something he never got to say or do?" Her partner shook his head. No, we're leaving. Now." But as he reached for her arm, the desk lamp flared to life, its light casting an otherworldly glow across the room. The walls seemed to ripple, the wood grain bending and shifting like water. And then, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound of typewriter keys clacking slow, deliberate, each keystroke echoing as if from a great distance. The woman spun around, searching for the source. The antique typewriter on the far shelf, once a dusty relic, now gleamed as its keys moved of their own accord. Words began to appear on the sheet of paper loaded into it, typed with an eerie precision. The scene begins again. The same mistakes, the same regrets. But this time someone else must decide. The paper stopped feeding, and the room fell silent once more. The woman approached the typewriter, her breath shallow. The message stared back at her, daring her to respond. Her hand hovered over the keys, but she hesitated. "Don't," her partner said, his voice shaking. "We don't know what'll happen." But before she could decide, the walls began to whisper. Soft at first, then louder, dozens of voices overlapping, urgent and pleading. Words like unfinished, regret, and truth surfaced, each carrying the weight of something unresolved. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, Brando's, unmistakable in its depth and gravity. "You hold the pen now," it said, as the room seemed to darken at its edges. "Do what I could not. But beware, the wrong ending comes with a cost." The woman felt a strange compulsion, as if the script and typewriter were pulling her forward. But the question burned in her mind: what was the right ending? And what would happen if she failed? The shadows on the walls began to shift again, taking the shapes of figures, some familiar, some unrecognizable, moving through scenes that felt fragmented, yet tantalizingly close to meaning. The house itself seemed to breathe, its essence entwined with whatever story Brando had left unfinished. And somewhere, just beyond their reach, the sound of faint applause started again, as if an unseen audience was waiting for a finale they might never receive. The faint applause grew louder, a ghostly echo filling the study, as if an unseen audience waited just beyond the veil of reality. The woman stood frozen, her hand trembling over the keys of the typewriter. Her friends whispered hurried pleas for her to leave, but she couldn't move. The house had her now, its pulsing energy wrapping around her like an unrelenting grip. Taking a deep breath, she began to type. The first words came haltingly, spilling onto the page like water breaking through a dam. As she wrote, the air in the room thickened, and the shadows on the walls became more defined. Figures materialized, playing out scenes that aligned with her words. A young man stood under a streetlight, arguing with a woman whose face was shrouded in darkness. A courtroom appeared, its benches empty but for one figure, Brando, sitting alone, his head bowed in defeat. The woman stopped, her fingers hovering over the keys. The shadows froze, turning to her as if waiting for her next move. "What happens next?" her partner whispered desperately. "How do you even know what to write?" "I don't," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I just feel it." She began typing again, faster this time, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. Her words pulled from some deep, unspoken well of emotion. The young man beneath the streetlight stepped forward, his voice echoing through the room. I loved you, but I was too afraid to say it. And now it's too late. The courtroom dissolved, replaced by a barren stage where Brando's shadow stood alone, speaking to no one. His voice, rich and mournful, filled the room. I couldn't face them. The truth. The fear that I wasn't enough. The words she typed poured out faster, the scenes unfolding in a chaotic but beautiful dance. The characters spoke, reconciled, and broke apart again, the narrative winding toward something inevitable. The applause grew louder, as if the unseen audience sensed the climax approaching. But as she reached the final lines, her fingers hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a voice, Brando's voice, whispered in her mind, "Beware. The wrong ending comes with a cost." "What if I get it wrong?" she asked aloud, her voice cracking. "You'll finish it," the figure of Brando said, stepping forward from the shadows. He was clearer now, his features sharpened into something achingly human. "Because you must." She typed the final sentence with trembling hands. As the last keystroke echoed through the room, everything stopped: the shadows, the whispers, the sound of the typewriter. Silence descended, oppressive and absolute. And then, slowly, the house began to change. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. The shadows dissolved, replaced by the warm glow of the lamp. The photograph on the desk seemed brighter, as if the burden it carried had been lifted. The applause swelled one last time, deafening and triumphant, before fading into nothingness. Brando's figure turned to her, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "You've done it," he said simply. "The ending, it's finally complete." Before she could respond, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the light. The last thing she saw was his eyes, filled with a peace that hadn't been there before. And then he was gone. The group stood in stunned silence, the room feeling eerily normal once more. The script on the desk was now pristine, its pages blank but for the words she had written. The woman picked it up, her hands trembling, and noticed something new on the last page. *Thank you. They left the house that night, locking the door behind them. Though they never spoke of it again, the woman sometimes swore she could still hear faint applause when she thought too long about that night. And the house? It stood quiet, as if finally at rest, a monument to an ending that had been waiting far too long to be told. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.